Good morning, friends. Today we are going to talk about the conceptual overview of nervous system organization, that how signs and symptoms are going to transfer to the brain, and then from brain how the uh, signal will come to the peripheries. So we'll talk about the overview. So you can see here central nervous system, that is CNS, can be divided into two parts. PNS, that is peripheral nervous system, which is sensory input. From here the things will go towards the central nervous system, and there is peripheral nervous system for the motor output, that is the signal they will bring. There is one sensory part, there is one motor part for somatic reasons, and as well as for the visceral parts. Then you can see PNS, there are two parts as I already told, sensory and motor. In sensory part, there is somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Somatic sensory means pain and temperature, vibration, fine touch, and proprioceptions. This will be taken from the somatic sensory. Visceral sensory means from the organs, that is pain and information about the physiological functions. The somatic means from the other than organs, that is body wall, skin, and all these things. Visceral will be typically for the viscerals. Then there is motor part. Again, it is of two types: somatic motor and visceral motor. Somatic motor is for the skeletal muscles, that is voluntary muscles, whatever signal are given. Visceral motor, again, there is two types: sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic, you can see it is from brain stem, then through thoracolumbar cord, sacral cord, and here it is how it is going to perform its function. Then there is parasympathetic. Parasympathetic, again, parasympathetic rest and digest. Cranial nerve number 3, 7, 9, innervate head and neck, 10 innervates thorax and most of the abdomen. Then this is how it is going to happen. Parasympathetic will be innervate remaining part of the abdomen plus pelvis plus perineum. So this is the total organization of the peripheral nervous system. Then about the upper motor neuron and motor neuron. Upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron form a two-way neuron pathway that is responsible for the movements. Upper motor neuron located in the cortex signals to element, that is lower motor neuron, whose cell bodies are located either in brain stem or directly on spinal cord, that is part of central nervous system. The axons of lower motor neuron then exits the central nervous system and become peripheral nerve. So upper motor neuron is basically for the cortex region, you can understand, central nervous system, and peripheral will be the, that is lower motor neuron will be for the peripheral nervous system that terminate in the motor end plate of the muscle. As you can see here, this is upper motor neuron, this is brain stem, midbrain, pons medulla, then via corticospinal tract, it will go to the lower motor neuron, and via this, it will form the peripheral nerve. The corticospinal tract is a prime example of descending motor pathway between upper motor neuron in the brain and lower motor neuron in the spinal cord. For the fibers or tracts, you can see previous videos which are already uploaded. Then this is the overview. Central nervous system coming from the peripheral nervous system. Then sensory division, motor division. Sensory division will be two types: somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Motor efferent division will be of again two types: somatic motor and visceral motor. And visceral motor will be again of two types: sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sensory neurons and information from sensory receptor to the CNS. The sensory receptors are specialized structure that detect the stimuli. Then motor efferent, they conduct the information via neurons from CNS to PNS. The motor neurons can be classified as upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron, as well as autonomic or somatic. Then somatic sensory fibers carry the sensory information from somites to CNS. Visceral sensory, they will carry the fibers from the internal organs, smooth muscles, and glands to CNS. Likewise, the motor somatic motor, it will carry the motor information from CNS to skeletal muscle. Visceral motor, it will carry the information from CNS to internal organs, as you can see in the diagram. Smooth muscles and glands, so they are also considered to be the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic is responsible for emergency, that is flight and flight of body function, response to stress and exercise. That you can see the increase in heart rate and all this. And parasympathetic will be for the rest and digest. Next, we have to see the parts of nervous system. So you can see there are certain parts here. The brain is there. The brain is the primary motor center of body. It responds to the incoming sensory signals, processes and modifies them based on the pre-existing information, and creates outgoing motor signals via upper motor neurons. We'll talk about these one by one afterwards also. Then you can see spinal cord. Spinal cord, you can see the primary posterior sensory nerve root, sensory ganglion, posterior part, ramus, peripheral nerve, which is the most of the both of them will form the part. Then neuromuscular junction, muscles, and the things more which have to be discussed is upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, sensory, and plexuses. So this is the total overview. These are the some small terms which every student should know perfectly so that they can go inside the neuroanatomy. So sensory receptors and nerves, they act as transducers. They transform physical or chemical stimuli into the electrical impulse. They have individual respective fields that allow us to discriminate the location of stimulus. Information travels either in large or small nerve fibers to the brain, can be classified as per the detection of the stimulus. So whatever has been understood by our body and has been transferred to the brain will be under to the sensory receptor. These are three types basically: extroreceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors. Extroreceptors means whatever is happening around us. So they can detect pain, temperature, touch, and pressure on the skin, exterior. Then proprioceptors, where am I? So these are the things which will be muscles, tendon, joints that detect the position and movement, whatever positions we are present, whether we are in correct position or erect position, or we are going to fall down. So all these things will be recepted by proprioceptors. Then there are interoceptors. This will be for the internal organs. So basically they detect the movement in gut, pH, and all other baroreceptors, chemicoreceptors which are present here. So this will be about the external points. If we talk about the clinical points on these points, so large sensory nerves carry touch, vibration, proprioceptive information. They are myelinated and fast conducting. Small sensory nerves, they carry pain, temperature, and autonomic information. They are unmyelinated and they are thus by slow conducting. So this was about the sensory receptors and nerve view. Then comes the peripheral nerve. Peripheral nerves are actually extensions of anterior and posterior rami. Anterior and posterior rami, when they both mix together, they form a peripheral nerve, which is present at each vertebral level. That's why the name is also according to the vertebral level only. They form the presynaptic component of neuromuscular junction for motor function or carry sensory information directly from the sensory receptors. Individual names are named according to structures they innervate, like something, the naming may be like if they're given to the nerve, ulnar part, it will be ulnar nerve, radial part, or radial nerve. Likewise, the nerves may be classified again on many different bases, like whether they are sensory, motor, autonomic, their size, their speed, everything can be considered. Pathology in one or more peripheral nerves results in motor or sensory dysfunction in specific nerve distribution. You might be recalling the dermatomes, patch of skin which is supplied by a single nerve. If something happens to that nerve, whole of that patch will be gone. There are some examples like mononeuropathy, which is for the single peripheral nerve. Symptoms may be limited to area of nerve, commonly due to the direct trauma. Mononeuropathy multiplex. This will be named peripheral nerves. Then multiple nerves will be involved. Symptoms will be limited to that all the nerves, and they may overlap also, like vasculitis, sarcoidosis. Then polyneuropathy, it is diffuse type of disease. Long nerve fibers with high metabolites are first affected. Then the other parts can be as a secondary points, like in the diabetes or vitamin deficiencies. Now coming to the ramus, you can see here there are two ramus, posterior ramus and anterior ramus. So posterior anterior ramus branch from the patient at each vertebral level. Anterior ramus that exists in the spine from the anterior ramus are directed to the limbs, anterolateral portion of trunks. These rami are generally large than the posterior one. The ventral ramus CLNS, that is cervical lumbar and spinal nerves, are connected as plexuses. You might recall cervical plexus, lumbar plexus. Posterior ramus, they exits from the spine from the posterior ramus part. They are small. They are directed towards the neck and posterior portion, back side. They innervate the muscles and skin. The rami are generally small. So pathology in ramus typically results in the mixed sensory and motor symptoms. Now talking about spinal nerve, when they both combine, both rami, that is posterior and anterior nerve root, anastomosis adjacent to the spinal cord to form a mixed spinal nerve. So remember, spinal nerves are always mixed type. These combined nerves then branch into the mixed rami known as anterior ramus and posterior ramus. This whole thing is called spinal nerve. Pathology results in mixed symptoms, similar presentation and nerve root damage, but with the involvement of nerves from both the posterior and anterior parts. So both the parts, wherever the nerve supply will be there, they will be having some pathological symptoms. Then what is spinal ganglion? Spinal ganglion contains the cell bodies of sensory pseudo-unipolar neurons. The axons of this type of neurons exist. The ganglion then split into two branches. So before splitting, there is a ganglion is present. If there is some pathology, it will be purely sensory symptom. Etiologies includes Sjogren's, saccharoids, HIV, paraneoplastic, cysteine, vitamin B6 excess, and idiopathic. Mostly they are idiopathic only. You can see here what does pseudo-unipolar neuron means. That it seems to look like unipolar. Then talking about nerve roots. The nerve roots are the exit points from the CNS, making the beginning of PNS. So there will be two again. The posterior will be called as dorsal. They passes through posterior root, enter the CNS via posterior horn of spinal cord, gray matter. Anterior, that will be also called as ventral roots. They exit through the anterior horn, which also has the location of cell bodies. Pathology in nerve root typically results in dermatological patterns, means a patch of skin will be having some symptoms. Myotomal patterns of motor neurons, element injury, asymmetric presentation. Pain may spread from spine to limbs. The common example are radiculopathy, that is focal symptom causing the damage to the one nerve root, polyradiographic multifocal, and polyradio neuropathy diffuse symptoms. Then talking about again spinal cord. Already these videos are loaded in detail. The spinal cord acts as a conduit between the modulator type of thing between the sensory receptors in the neck, trunk, limb, and brain, between the brain and lower motor neuron. So there will be part like motor efferent, then sensory. You see the motor also. You can see the sensory also. The visceral motor. Symptoms would be somatotrophic organization of symptoms, spinothalamic tract dysfunction, contralaterally, that is impaired pain and temperature sensation, posterior column medial lemniscus dysfunctions, ipsilaterally, then impaired proprioception, vibration sensation. All these things you can see in detail in previous slides or lectures which are already uploaded. Brain itself is a very big topic. You can simply understand it is the primary controlling center having two parts, motor and efferent. The big concept which you can understand here is like this. You can see the motor, brain, the cortex part, fibers cross in the midline. You can see the bigger concept is fiber cross in the midline. You can see the upper motor neuron. Then these are other fibers which are again crossing in the midline only. So this is midline, the dotted line is midline, and they cross it via PCML pathway or corticospinal pathway, then to the lower motor neuron, and then they will. Thus, pathology in brain typically results in contralateral sensory or motor symptom. But always there are some exceptions also which we should keep in the mind. Now talking about upper motor neuron, these are descending motor tracts from the cortex and brain stem. Cortex one are corticospinal and corticobulbar, and brain stems are vestibulospinal, reticulospinal. You can see the previous lectures as I have alluded to, and they are going to influence the element, that is lower motor neuron. So our brain sends motor signals down through these upper motor neurons in order for the signal to reach your lower motor neuron and ultimately causing some movement. So if some pathology occurs, then what will happen? There will be increased tone, spasticity, hyperflexia, extensor response, like big toe up, that is when viscous reflex, clonus, disuse atrophy, no fasciculations. So remember these some symptoms. If these type of symptoms are present in your patient, then basically it can be the case of upper motor neuron. Then talking about lower motor neuron, these are the motor neurons from the anterior horn on spinal cord and brain stem nuclei of central nervous nerves in the brain. They snap with upper motor neuron in spinal cord or brain stem in order for the signal to continue towards the target. Now, if some pathology occurs here, so there will be a decrease in the tone, hypoflexia, flexor response, no clonus, atrophy, and fasciculations will be present. So remember, little bit opposite type of symptoms are present in the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron diseases. And you should remember these 2 points for the difference between upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron also. Basically, this question comes in exams. Then plexus. Plexus is the network of anastomose anterior rami from multiple vertebral level to do the variable functions like cervical, brachial. So there will be a asymmetric presentation. Usually one limb is affected if one part or one side of the plexuses are involved. A big topic, many lectures are there. You can see previous lectures. Then coming to the neuromuscular junction, this is the part where the transmission actually takes place. So it is an area where electrical signals from lower motor neuron are transduced into the chemical signals that can be interpreted and understood by the muscles. So whatever signals brain has sent, it will be here converted into the electrical part, and then there will be some action will happen, either contraction or whatever it is. So neuromuscular junction has presynaptic terminal end, synaptic part, and postsynaptic. You can see here this upper part which is coming via nerve is presynaptic. Then this pool-like of thing is synaptic, where actually the transfusion will take place. And this is postsynaptic, the part of muscle fiber, where the gates will be open and then the action will be happening. So if pathology occurs here, the motor symptoms basically are proximal weakness greater than the distal weakness, ptosis, diplopia, facial weakness, dysarthria may occur from the cranial motor nerves, and symptoms of fatigable in nature. Last part of this transmission, this whole thing will be the muscles where the actually action is going to happen. So they take the signal from lower motor neuron, which causes them into contract, allowing us to perform the voluntary and involuntary. There are different type of muscles. Everybody knows skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. So if a problem is here, the motor symptoms will be only present. Mostly proximal will be the feet, that is shoulder or hip muscles, wherever the bunch of muscle nerves will be present. Mostly symmetric. Reflexes are normal or decreased. May have stiffness or cramps or no sensory loss. So, jitna dur nerve injury, there will be symptoms will be less or they will be concise. Towards the central nervous system, the symptom will be more diffused, and there can be contralateral or ipsilateral, all these things will come. So this was all about the overview. Next lecture, I will present you a case and how to do the diagnosis on basis of that case. Thank you.